Hi, everyone. Welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics podcast. I'm joined by our publisher, Brian Storseth, and Kenzie McKeegan from Loyalist Public Affairs, and I'm your host, Mark Vigliotti. We have a lot to get through in this jam-packed episode, so I won't waste too much time with the niceties, but it's great to have Brian with us and Kenzie again. So let's start with, I guess, the big news in terms of federal politics, and that is Mark Carney's much hyped pre-budget speech on his government's economic plan in advance of the budget that we're going to get tabled next week. Brian, maybe I'll start with you. What did you make of that speech, which was, I don't think there was anything terribly new except for maybe that pledge to double our non-U.S. exports, but also mentioned, needing to diversify, building up the economy, but also hint at some sacrifices we needed to make as part of this push.
Yeah, well, first of all, Marco, great to be back with you again. I want to welcome Kenzie to the podcast. It's great having her here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think there was a lot of theater. There was a lot of good B-roll for upcoming ads that are going to be put out there. But the reality is often when the Prime Minister is talking about these things, he's a pretty substantive guy. He's putting out some feelers out there for what's going to possibly be coming. And it's the first time that I really seen a hint from this government that there could be actual cuts to programs. I don't see how else the government's going to get to the numbers that it seems pretty determined to get to without some program cuts. And it's kind of the first time with some of the language around it that you saw that. But, other than that, big deficits, trying to get things under control, more of the same of what we've kind of been seeing and what Canadians expect to see probably after listening to the government now on November 4th.
And Kenji, you get that same sense? I know it was one of these, awkward kind of dances that the Prime Minister had to do during the campaign. On one hand, talking about the need to restrain spending, how we were going to balance this operational budget, while at the same time, don't worry, no social programs would be cut. Is that what he's hinting at? That, hey, we're going to have to live with some spending cuts and that may impact some services? Or is it something different that he's trying to communicate?
I think that he's trying to really continue to understand what people in Canada are going through right now and speak to the fact that people want to see fiscal restraint and they want to understand that he has a plan and that he's putting the plan into action. And so I think we're continuing to hear him give confidence to Canadians in that way, in that he is really looking to do things differently than the previous government and to take a new lens on these programs and to make sure that these programs are working. And I don't think that necessarily means cuts, but to ensure that there's efficiency in these things.
Yeah. And one thing too that came up, this talk of sacrifice and needing to restrain spending was also this sense too that, Canada's economy, maybe underperforming is too strong of a word, but definitely hasn't been as, hasn't seen that sort of, intensity, hasn't seen that efficiency that you would like to see it. And it did seem like he was kind of blaming the, regulatory situation here in Ottawa, kind of, saying that things have just been kind of trudging along way too slowly. If you're, Kenzie, you wear your liberal allegiances proudly on your sleeve. Do you not take that as a bit how do you kind of sell that to liberals who have fond memories maybe of Justin Trudeau's time in office? But what else do you interpret that other than a criticism of the guy who was occupying that chair a few months ago?
Well, we're in a different time. There's tariffs now. It's a whole different situation going on. And so there, I think, is a new understanding of how different geopolitical situations are unfolding. And it's just a different time than in the previous government.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And Brian, what do you make of that? It seems to be, kind of him pointing the finger at the previous administration, which he's kind of, in terms of membership, he's kind of surrounding himself by a lot of the people who were there, a short time ago.
Well, to be clear, he is pointing the finger at the new administration, just like any new government that comes in and, likes to talk about being a new government. I think the reality is there was an election earlier this year that it was pretty clear that Canadians wanted a change in direction. And a lot of what the Prime Minister ran on was he was the responsible change. And so to be fair, when he's talking about some of the things he's talking about and some of the programs that you're starting to see not to go out the door as much, like you got $100 million in the Green Infrastructure Fund that's still kind of seemingly stuck there. Some of these things, like there's a real priority shift in getting the government's fiscal house in order, I think is fair to say. And when you're on year 10 or 11 of a government, you've got to try to reshape things and liven it up. We've seen it. It's not a new thing. Look, I'm from Alberta. Ralph Klein was the best at this, right? Like he came in on year like 20 of a government mandate and said, oh yeah, but we're all new, right? So I think the Prime Minister's trying to hit the right tone in this, but the reality is when you're looking at the deficit numbers that they're starting to talk, like if you start talking 60, 70, 80 billion dollars in deficit, you got to do something to get the fiscal house in order, and it's hard to do that through attrition. There's a need for it to happen sooner.
Yeah, on the flip side of that, though, some of the things that Carney kind of spelled out that he would do, like, things that were already in C5 in terms of removing internal trade barriers, making it easier for bigger projects to get built. He also spoke about how it was going to be a great time to be in the skills trades, how we need to speed up home construction, diversify our trade markets, and also tap into our energy superpower status there. These are things that seem to be cribbed or at least borrow heavily from the Conservative playbook. And, Pierre Poilievre was pretty critical of that speech. And I asked them, during this, I think last week, during a media availability, how do you how are you criticizing someone who's basically reading from your handbook? So, if Mark Carney is, facing those attacks from these opposition parties, for the Conservatives, Kenzie, does not put them in a tough situation that they essentially have to criticize someone who is parroting or, basically singing from the same songbook here?
I think it definitely puts them in an interesting position. The Liberal government under Prime Minister Carney has certainly taken over the centre and has really taken that vote away from the Conservatives. And as we see the Conservative base turning to the Prime Minister as someone that they trust and want to support, that certainly increases the pressure on Pierre. Pierre had, I think, no shame about turning to a very far right to support him in this, and that alienated some people in the middle that have now turned to Liberals. And so it's no surprise to me that the Liberals would want to be going through some of these things that the Conservatives had put forward, because why not see if there's good parts of these plans, if people like them, how do we make them that for a more moderate and more central, and see if they're good ideas. And so, of course, having someone else go through your ideas and perhaps make them even better does present a challenge.
Yeah, that's a good point. Brian, what do you think about that? I know we're not going to see it, or at least anytime soon, some of those F Carney flags rolling out anytime. But, does he put Pierre in a difficult position that, you essentially have to go so far right to criticize someone who seems to be very comfortable kind of sharing that space in that center with you on some of these big issues?
Well, I'm not sure you have to go to an extreme in this situation. Hard to argue that there isn't some extremes coming out of this and some similarities to what you're seeing in the US. But I reject the premise that you have to go far to the right. Like, listen, if Mark Carney wants to run a Stephen Harper government, good for him. The country will be better for it. But at the end of the day, I think you're seeing as much resentment from Liberals as you are from partisan Conservatives. What Canadians, though, I think want is just good government in a really tough economic time right now. And they're less concerned about whether it's Liberal or Conservative philosophy that's coming through. They want to know that there's going to be jobs and food on the table for their families. It's a tough time out there in the economy. The one thing I would say, like from Pierre's perspective, from any opposition perspective, this government's in a tough spot. You're coming out of an election promising things you have no real control of. They have no control of whether they're going to get a deal with Donald Trump or not. Major projects, announcing some of these things, it all sounds good. What I would be doing is focusing on helping the country through this, in opposition. It's not always the criticism that gets you the most. Sometimes it's the perception of actually trying to put the partisanship away and move forward on big issues. At the end of the day, it's going to be the government is going to win or lose based on whether they accomplish the things that they're talking about and they've campaigned on. And these are pretty big objectives that they've campaigned on and promised.
If I could add one other thing, I think, though, that in terms of Pierre and the potential to alienate a little bit by going a bit farther right with some of these things in that election, he may have alienated some of his caucus members in places like the Maritimes and Quebec, that now, as you're saying, when Canada wants good government, it presents an opportunity for this minority government to seek allegiances with people that might be feeling like they don't have a place within that Conservative Party with some of those comments.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kenzie.
Hard to do though when you just got out of running for the guy. Like, I think we're kind of coming into the conversation of floor crossers. I think it's a legitimate conversation, right? And it's all the buzz in Ottawa right now, right? Who's crossing the floor? Look at your neighbor. The MPs are walking around. Are you hanging out with us? Are you going to be on the other side? Awkward times. Been through some of this stuff, seen it. Obviously, I never crossed the floor. They had probably burnt my house down back in St. Paul if I would have. But the reality of it is, listen, floor crossing, it to me, and this is just my opinion, if you ran for an election 6 months ago and you vehemently disagree and you think Kenzie has a good point and we need to help get this budget across because it's important for the country, then go sit as an independent and vote for him. Don't make a deal so that you financially benefit or you get a better position or post in life. Like if you're that convinced, go sit as an independent, and then that has happened in the past. And to me, that's far more legitimate way than to be like, which cabinet CD got for me, Marco, today.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I just love the idea of like Elizabeth May trying to sit you down in her room, be like, Brian, what do I need to get you to come over to the Green Party?
Well, there was a time, Marco. There was a time.
She had her work cut out for her. Speaking of government, and speaking of a government that has never been accused of any wrongdoing and has a sterling, clean ethics record, the Ford government has announced some pretty big changes. This past week, earlier this week, they said that they're going to make changes to the election rules, getting rid of those American-style fixed election dates, getting rid of pre-writ spending limits, and also, they introduced a big rent/housing bill, and they kind of walked back a piece that would potentially lead to the end of yearly leases, or sorry, I shouldn't say yearly leases, but security of tenure, which allows you to essentially stay in your unit until you want to leave. Brian, let's start off with the election changes. I know you flag that spending limits as being the most consequential. Is that really what's at stake here with what this government's trying to do, trying to, quote unquote, rig the conditions for their next election?
Wow. I mean, rigged is a strong word, Marco, but I think that's what every government tries to do. I can't remember the last government the Harper government was the last one I can actually remember that lived up to like a fixed election date. Maybe cherry picking here, but like, it just seems like ever since the idea of fixed election dates came about and started getting implemented, that I can remember, governments have always just found a reason to go whenever they want to anyways, when it happens to conveniently bend it, what's their best time for them. I do think the spending changes are a massive change to this that maybe isn't getting the media pickup that it should have. It's going back to kind of pre-Kathleen Wynne days where, if you're the guys that have the unions now on your side and the people with the big pockets to do the pre-election spending, that's going to be tens of millions of dollars to help crystallize people's opinion of your opposition is going to be a big deal.
Yeah. Sorry, I did want to add one correction, Brian. You mentioned Miss Wynne. She did serve out her term before the fixed election date, and she also brought in those tougher spending limits. So maybe Stephen Harper is a big Kathleen Wynne fan, or vice versa. But they on the same page when it comes to the election changes. Kenzie, what do you make of what we're seeing from the Ford camp here?
I think in terms of this discussion, it'll be interesting to see how, as you said, media continues to discuss this and how the public does, and also how opposition parties in Ontario do. I think it's certainly with Ontario Liberals, the leadership race ongoing, and it certainly will be interesting to hear perspectives coming out of that side. And as you just said, with Kathleen Wynne having made those changes, and I think it provides an opportunity for the party to have that debate in public discourse. But on the matter of the change in housing policy with rent, and I think it's really interesting because this premier certainly has a way of changing his mind when there's a discomfort with a position that he's taken, and without coming across as a flip-flopper. And I think that that's an incredibly unique skill to have, certainly maintaining the trust of folks while changing his mind so frequently on certain things, while understanding that he's listened and changes his mind. So I think that that's something that is super notable with this. And it's something that I think he shows that he listens to people, but it's an interesting thing to have happened at the same time. as this electoral changes.
What do you make of that, Brian, though? It seems like, to Kenzie's point, this is a premier who, I don't know if it's a deliberate trial balloon. I don't know if he's testing the waters or what, but he does seem to have this predilection to say one thing and then retreat quite quickly, and no one seems to call him a flip-flop, or he seems to be the Teflon premier when it comes to this. What do you make of that?
Well, listen, it is his superpower, like the speed cameras issue. Like last I checked, it was his government that brought them in the first place, that they're so terrible that he's now getting rid of. Like, it is his superpower. He has the ability to connect with people as he hears what's going on in the ground, and has the ability to readjust his position. Part of it is, Harper used to always get the criticism that he wouldn't say sorry, wouldn't admit that he was wrong. And for a while in Canadian and American politics, it became a thing, right? Like you never showed the weakness, no matter what, no matter how ridiculous you sounded in your fake apology, you never really apologized. Ford's just like, oh, but yeah, I got that wrong. We all do. Sorry, we'll fix it. Right? Like, and he has this ability to get out there ahead of things quickly, like the scalper issue. This is a small, obviously, issue, but like in Toronto and Ontario, everybody's watching the Blue Jays. Like, he's topical with simple, basic things that people agree with. So I don't know. It's his superpower. And until the opposition finds a way to really grab onto some of these, like, he's pulling at like 50%.
I think it speaks to his personability. And it's something that the opposition need to tap into, is finding that personability for voters. And, the Ontario Liberals, again, have that opportunity to put something forward that does meet that. So I think it adds an interesting context to everything that's ongoing right now with the Ontario Liberals.
Kenzie, I got to ask you a question, though, and not trying to put you on the spot, but feel free to dance around this. But without saying who the person is, what does that person look like? I think it's fair to say that the Ontario Liberals have not come up with the best candidate to run up against Doug Ford. What does that candidate actually look like?
I think it's someone that is, as we both we've all been saying about Premier Ford, is that it's really understands and speaks to the moment, is relevant, and seems to tap into exactly what people are thinking, not in terms of a policy, but how they feel about the situation. And so I think that person would have to be someone that is able to speak to the general side of these things with confidence, and to really understand the sensitivities that people are feeling on the ground.
I was going to say, Kenzie, Brian brought up the scalping issue. As a Liberal, Kathleen Wynne was putting forward, or had put in place, a law that would really limit the ability to resell tickets on that market. And Ford, one of the first things he just, when he came into office, was just not enforce that law and eventually scrap it. So, to Brian's point, yeah, it seems like, you guys are trying to find the right sauce there, but the fact that he keeps flip-flopping on several issues, how come the Liberals, can't even take credit or can't even get a win off the fact that he seems to come around to their position? Like, is it just driving you nuts? Are you pulling out your hair saying, how come they seem to just like the message coming from this guy, not from us?
There's quite a few things that the Wynne government did that are now happening again. And I think as a Liberal, it's nice to see these things actually happening. They should have happened earlier. I think the recognition that these things are from the Ontario Liberals will come. There's a bit of a honeymoon phase still going on. The Ontario Liberals were in power for 15 years in Ontario. Now, Doug Ford's only had about 7. And I think honeymoon phase probably lasts around 8. So we're not really seeing, I think, a challenge to some of these things just yet. And once the challenge presents, then it becomes a little bit more clear, okay, well, when did this actually happen? And those lines can happen in terms of when changes actually could have been made, and how much time has been wasted potentially by making those changes later. And I think part of the reason that the Ontario Liberals can't get that credit is because of the challenges with leadership and things like that, and getting our footing and getting in the legislature again. And I thought it's fantastic to see the Ontario Liberals back in action in question period as a party. So I think we're seeing a lot of things happen within the party, but it might not be that public recognition just yet.
So to that point, and to put you on the spot a bit, how quickly does this leadership election need to happen? Are you kind of under the gun here, and you need to get someone in there quickly to show up against Doug Ford? Do you spend some more time and maybe, lick some wounds and really do a deep dive into what didn't go right during the last election?
Yeah, I think it's important to take our time and figure out what Ontarians want, who wants to do this, and really, I think, to figure out if what's the matter of having a new face come in, or is it a matter of having someone that's within caucus? And there's, I think, a conversation that needs to be had amongst Ontario Liberals about that at the same time as what a new face would look like.
Well, look, I'm not one that's going to buy an Ontario Liberal membership and vote in this, but I think you should just get John Fraser already. You keep making him interim leader. It's give the guy a shot already. But what I would actually say is I think there's some, and correct me if I'm wrong here, there's some similarities, what we talked about earlier, right? Difficult for Pierre to sometimes attack Carney on conservative ideas. The same kind of applies sometimes with Doug Ford. He's not afraid of stealing your popular Liberal ideology if that's what's going to get him across the finish line at times, right? He's very pragmatic, and what I've seen from Liberal leaders is leaders that keep fighting for that same percentage of vote that is narrowly within the Liberal PC battle, as we saw Trudeau come in and do, is come and eat up, and Notley in Alberta, obviously with her own party, but eat up that NDP vote. And that seems to me to be kind of part of the end. But what do I know? I'm good with the way things are too.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Brian. I remember after 2019, there was a lot of talk of for Trudeau voters, people who backed Ford in that 2018 election, then 2019 turned around and backed Trudeau. It seems like the Ford Carney voter would be an easier kind of leap. They seem to be, to both your points, playing in that same sandbox. And it seems like they get along very well, and they seem to have the same approach on a lot of big issues. I guess we, to Brian's point, we have a Liberal government in all but name in both seats of power. What do you make of that, Kenzie?
I would say we have already have an Ontario Liberal option, and it's not Doug Ford. He is definitely a progressive conservative. And so, sure, there's great ideas that have come from the Liberals, but the Liberals are still solidly our own situation going on there. I think if Doug Ford, if you called him a Liberal there, he would feel the same way. He is not.
To be clear, Marco, that was you calling him a Liberal?
Oh, yeah, I know. There's a bike lane in my neighborhood. I assume he's going to get rid of it as a result of me accusing him of that. So moving on, I wanted to talk about the major projects list. Looks like we're going to have a new tranche of projects named for the Grey Cup. We've seen 5 projects come forward, and the big criticism was, well, you're not really helping them that much. They're already close to completion, or they're already on that path. We know that with the Darlington, for example, it didn't seem to really need anything other than approval from our nuclear regulator. And it's not even a bill that, part of C5 could move ahead on. So some questions about how useful this is, but I guess this is all happening in the context of a big push from Alberta to advance a pipeline project that still doesn't have a private sector proponent. And I'm sure, Brian, you would know this better than anyone else, the kind of intense lobbying the PMO must be getting from MPs within that caucus to say, hey, pick my project, pick the projects in my region. Are we kind of overhyping this thing? What do you think we're going to see when these projects get announced right before the Grey Cup?
I mean, look, you hit the nail on the head. The first list was a bunch of projects that were already in process. Maybe they were in such a bad spot they needed some additional support from the government, but the government hasn't even gazetted these yet. Let's be clear, this is 100% has been a press release and a comms exercise to this point in time, because the very first thing that you have to do to get on the major projects list, and in order to get in, Alberta is obviously pushing, but not just Alberta. If you look at the pipeline, and there's different discussions, right? Everybody has an idea where they would like a pipeline to go, but getting a northern port opened in our country is a really good idea. I think Churchill makes a lot of sense. There's got to be another LNG play that gets put into this. So I think the first question is, how big's the list? Is it going to be, I'm hearing anything from 2 to 4 projects. And then at what level of completion are these projects going to be, and how quickly is the government going to move forward with it after that to really get, if you're talking nation building, you're looking at potash, you're looking at all different sorts of agricultural products, forestry products. But if all of your trade routes go north and south, there's only so much you can do with that. So I do think that there's a huge need for more options when it comes to pipelines, but almost everything and anything that we do as a country, we need to be able to move it east and west throughout our own country. And I think that's the biggest thing that the government can take on.
What do you make of that, Kenzie? Do you think it's just a calm exercise? The PM's also said, he's going to look for consensus, and that may squash the possibility of, that pipeline Brian talked about going to Alberta. Like, is this just a comms exercise? Or you're just saying, I'm going to choose projects that are at this certain stage of readiness, and also that no one's going to disagree with?
Well, I think in terms of if it is a comms project, it makes it more difficult for the Danielle Smith government to move that project forward and using separatist language. And I'm not sure that will fly in terms of, a one nation approach. So if it is a comms exercise, that's going to make it more difficult in terms of the lobbying coming into the PMO, I would say. And that even as a comms exercise, there has to be an understanding of that language together, of that nation building, and of that project benefiting Canada as a nation. And so, if for building out that pipeline, it forces the question of, okay, then how does this benefit all of Canada? And it makes the people lobbying the PMO for that have to answer that. So,
sorry, go ahead.
No, even if it is a comms exercise, I think it forces those questions to be answered about these projects.
Yeah, not to put you in a box, Brian, but as the resident Albertan here, what do you make of that? If you do use Danielle Smith's language about, Alberta's oil, Alberta this, and, how it's basically something that you need to do to stem the separatist tide, do you kind of defeat your own language talking about it being a nation building project if you use that lens?
And if you don't have the capacity to do that, it really does create economic viability issues for you as a nation, right? Like, we have to be able to get our products to Tidewater. Any country that is its own sovereign nation has to be able to get its products to Tidewater, and not just one. Like, we have, we've got the north, the east, and the west. We've got to be able to get to all of them. I think I love some of the commitments that they've made around defense, which I think blends into all of this, right? Like, securing the north, building up our presence in the north more can be a part of all of this. So, absolutely. But is there a need for a pipeline? Is there a lot of lobbying going on between governments? I think it's probably more at the provincial levels than, there isn't a tremendous Saskatchewan, Alberta caucus inside the Liberal government. So at the end of the day, I would imagine any of those Alberta MPs would be pushing for a pipeline. To be clear, my good friend Ryan Adam always reminds me of this, was from Alberta. It was the Trudeau government that built the last pipeline going through BC. So I don't care who has the ownership of it. Just, we need to be able to continue to move our products from east to west in order to be able. Well, you can't threaten the Americans that we're going to do anything about our supply to the United States if they're the only place we can send our product.
Yeah. Well, he did also float the idea of reviving Keystone, which kind of makes we're captive to the Americans there. But to Brian's point about how this is a nation building project, and that we need to boost our economy and strengthen our economy. It's just like a bit of a competing vision there, Kenzie, in that on one hand, it's like you have to show the proof that what you're doing here is going to help our economy. But at the same time, I think to both your points, there's that kind of exercise there being like, well, how do you kind of spread the wealth out here? So how do you counteract that, making sure that everyone in your caucus or everyone, has their pet project, get this certain appropriate, look through, but at the same time, maybe that Saskatchewan mine isn't that big of a deal. Maybe that a project in the East Coast doesn't win the approval. Like, how do you, I guess, balance those things out?
I think really this list is about finding projects that are easy ways to boost our exports and to create new, as Brian was saying, new export markets. And as we've seen with ASEAN the other week, and really opening those ties outside of our U.S. trade agreements and things like that, I think it's really trying to identify those projects that can also create those new pathways. So it's not only about how it will show that where the wealth goes within Canada or how that's all spread around here, but also what it will do to diversify our export markets.
No, that's a good point. I guess to kind of, as part of this conversation, the PM during his speech talked about releasing Canada's new climate competitiveness strategy as part of this whole push to boost the Canadian economy. We're thinking that might see, the repeal of the oil and gas emissions cap, maybe some other potential walkbacks from Trudeau era environmental policies. Kenzie, how do you, as a good liberal, how do you balance those two things with some potentially aggressive changes to environment policy in this, at the same time, in this pursuit of a stronger economy in this tumultuous time we're in?
Yeah, well, we've definitely seen Prime Minister Carney take a different stance than the previous government on some of these issues. And I think that focus is resonating with Canadians, certainly. So I think we will see more of that.
And Brian, I know you were a big fan of the oil and gas emissions cap. So would you be disappointed, or what would you make of Carney kind of making these potential changes?
Well, listen, I'm hesitant to speak on what he may or may not do that hasn't come about yet, but certainly there are things we have to do to free up our economy. But at the same time, 100% you have to be environmentally responsible and forthright in doing so. Tend to believe, look, when we were in government, our best years, I always thought were our opposition years, where we had to take the best of your ideas and the best of our ideas and meet somewhere in between. And it usually ended up being the right answer. And that's what we got to do in these times of global economic uncertainty. And that's, so do we have to loosen up some of these things that the industry and other governments are telling us that are hindering? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, you still have to maintain that environmental standard. It is in the best interest of the country and people.
Yeah, no, both great points. So all the topics we had for this week's edition, I wanted to give everyone one last opportunity to talk about something they're looking forward to next week. Of course, that's budget week. Kenzie, start with you. What's one thing you're kind of paying attention to next week?
Budget week and Ontario Fall Economic Statement.
Sure.
Hey, it'll be a big week. I'm very much looking forward to both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how did I forget about that one? Yeah, how did I forget about the Ontario Fall Economic Statement? Maybe that's deliberate, that kind of hide behind the federal budget. Brian, what are you kind of looking forward to?
I guess, first of all, November 4th and 6th are going to be important days for the country with the budget. I'm looking forward to seeing what that number is. That highly anticipated deficit number. Is it 60 billion? Is it 70 billion? Is it 80 billion? Does it get to a point where there's too many billions that anybody cares? The other piece is then following up, like a piece that doesn't often, and not a critique, Marco, but I don't feel like we talk about enough in media, is like the issue of the subnational debt in this country is worse than the issue of the national debt. So what is Ontario's fall economic update going to look like? I'll be interested to see what Peter Bartholomew has to say about that. And the last thing, I got to give a shout out to Paul Calandra. I mean, this guy is trying to drive and move change in Ontario, and moving forward, even after the trustee resigned, was still moving the legislation forward was a bit of a baller move. So
I think in terms of subnational debt, I think a wise premier once said there's only one taxpayer. So that's the most fiscal conservatism that Ford has ever said. Obviously, budget week will be interesting. Very curious to see how the political parties in Ottawa respond to it. The NDP, has said we don't need austerity. It looks like we're getting some sort of spending cuts. The Bloc is all over the place. They are worried about the size of the deficit, but at the same time calling for billions in new spending. And then the Conservatives they're talking about a debt deficit number that we know we're going to blow past. They're talking about tax cuts, some of which are already moving forward, other ones that aren't really tax cuts, like getting rid of the industrial carbon pricing system. And then, so how do you find one of those parties to play ball when I would imagine that most of them, if not all of them, don't want another election? It seems like the Liberals are already doing this thing. And it reminded me, Brian, you talked about, the early Harper days. It felt like in those early days, those early years of government, you guys were getting so much passed because you were daring the opposition parties to defeat you, saying, you want to go to another election? Let's do this thing. And then at the end of the Trudeau era, it was, oh God, what can we do to avoid another election? Like, what can we put forward? And that's how you're on your back foot. Right now, it seems like we're shifting back to that Harper era minority government, the Liberal. They're, the government House Leader Stephen McKinnon saying, oh, I'm worried about the potential budget vote. I call BS on that. I think they're just going to strong arm them. This is all, bluffing. Like, dare you to oppose us? If we lose this budget vote, we'll go back to the polls and they will blame you, not us. So I'm curious what you think about that, Brian. Do you think we're positively Harper-esque right now when it comes to our minority?
More than that, I think governments are better when they're strong. These guys are the Carney government is certainly acting like a government that isn't scared of an election. So I think that empowers and enables them to do the things that they think are right. And as long as they continue to go down the track that the majority of Canadians agree with, they're in a good spot. The opposition parties will always find a way to make sure that, especially with the number of seats that they need to just not show up to vote, they'll make sure that there isn't an election if it's in the Liberals' best interest at the end of the day. So I think it's a better way to govern. To be honest with you, I think looking desperate to avoid an election is always thing. Now your Doug Ford quote, you realize he's quoting Reagan, which is apparently one of his strengths these days.
I was going to say it's a habit of the now. Like I said, that's all we have for this week's edition. Thanks both of you for the excellent insights. We will be back here in front of you fine folks next week, likely with a lot more budget discussion. So thanks everyone for joining us for No Talking Points. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.